Welcome to the inaugural podcast of the Japan Startup Megaphone. This podcast is being presented by Akihabara News, a division of the Shingetsu News Agency. My name is Michael Penn, and I'm your host for today. And I think we have a really exciting podcast in which to start off with because we're going to be interviewing Yan Fan. She's a Chinese American who lives here in Tokyo, and of course we ourselves are coming to you from the heart of Tokyo to the world. Our theme is to discuss about startups, of course, and technology. If you stick with us today, what we will be discussing over the course of the podcast is Codechrysalis, which is the boot camp which trains software engineers, which was co-founded by Ms. Fan. And we cover a number of other interesting topics, such as the lack of software engineers in Japan. Japan kind of missed the software revolution when a lot of other countries powered ahead, even though it continues to be very strong in hardware. We also talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of the Japanese startups, what mistake they may be making that limits their ability to make an impact on the global scene. We also talk about the shifting mindsets of young Japanese. In the past, they were much more reluctant to go into venture businesses, but this is beginning to change step by step. We also talk a little bit about the special challenges that can be faced by women in the workplace here in Japan, as well as foreign nationals who are working here in Tokyo or other parts of Japan. And finally, in spite of all of the things which can be challenges or can be wrong about Japan, we also talk about why it is still a very exciting place to be and why people should be paying attention to what's going on here. Okay, well, now we move into our interview. Our guest is one who I'm very happy to have with us. Her name is Yan Fan, and she is the co-founder and chief technology officer of Codechrysalis, which is, as I understand it, a sort of boot camp. But I will let her explain in considerably more detail what it is. So, in what respect is your organization a boot camp, and a boot camp for what purpose?
Yeah, so boot camps are really just, ways to disrupt education, right? And for us, I think, we wanted to find a way to bring more software engineers into an industry that was very lacking, right? As we know, software engineers, there's a huge dearth of software engineers, especially in Japan. And this is a skill, this is an occupation where we can train someone up in a very short amount of time. So our bootcamp, the program that we're most well known for, is a 3-month full-time immersive where people can become software engineers after. And it's a bit different. So there's actually quite a few boot camps in Japan. We're very different in that we don't take our main program doesn't take beginners. So we want to see people make an effort to learn topics on their own, learn how to code on their own, and then we sort of bring them that last step of the way. Sort of like the last sort of like the last marathon in this long career change, so we've been running for about a bit more than 3 years now. We've graduated hundreds of people, and they've gone on to become software engineers working at companies like large companies like Google and Mercari and Sony, and small companies as well, and also startups in the Tokyo space. So Paydi, Moneytree, Zehitomo, etc. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Now, a lot of people maybe overseas who are hearing us might be a little surprised by your comment that software engineers and the education of software engineers in Japan might be behind some other countries, some other advanced countries. What's your evaluation of that, and why would Japan, which has this reputation for being a very high technology, innovative country, might be behind in this aspect of its education?
Oh yeah, it's a systemic issue actually, and actually, if you take a look at software that Japan produces, it's not shocking, right? I mean, we see the websites that they have here. There aren't really any large software focused technology firms in Japan, right? Like the different services that we use here, it's like Google and Twitter and Facebook, right? And these are all not Japanese companies. It's a huge systemic issue. Japan has been really strong in hardware, and they continue to remain so. And I think in Japan's heyday in the 80s and 90s, they sort of looked to the future as being very hardware driven. Right. And so they were working towards that future. However, that's not what happened. Right now we live in a world where hardware is just a commodity and software is really what drives value. It's really what creates businesses, et cetera. And Japan really missed the boat on that. And so they're really scrambling to try to get back into the forefront of where technology has headed. And so if you think about it on the systemic level, from the university level, electrical and mechanical engineering departments are much stronger than the computer science or software engineering arms, right? There's also a very weak connection between employers and software engineering or computer science programs, right? Versus in the US, you see such a strong connection between Silicon Valley and then Stanford and UC Berkeley, right? There's not that kind of relationship really going on in Japan. And then even getting a PhD in computer science here or AI, it doesn't pay as well as you would getting one from Stanford and then, making buckets of money after you graduate the program. That just doesn't really happen here. And then on a corporate level, I think technology has continued to be under prioritized because the people leading these massive companies, they are not very tech savvy, right, when it comes to adopting software. And so you can imagine, this is a huge systemic issue from universities up to, exec levels at these large companies. Yeah. So that's what we're seeing. And we're hoping to overturn that by, um, operating here. As Codechrysalis, we're able to train up individuals, right, and giving them the skills that they need to be successful. And then we also do corporate training. So we can go into these large companies and educate and help them train their workforce, educate their executives, et cetera. And so, I think we are one of the few solutions in the market, maybe the only solution in Japan that has this sort of like really wide ranging ability to tackle this issue from many different sides, right? From the grassroots level to the executive level. And yes, it's pretty exciting.
It sounds like it. So if Japan did miss the boat sort of on the software revolution, maybe in the 1990s in the first decade of this century. You mentioned that they well, how far have they come in catching up? I mean, for example, if these big companies were slow to adapt to what was happening in their industries, what about the smaller companies and the startup scene in Japan? Is it making up ground, or are they so far behind that they just have a long, long way to go?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think from the way that I view it, startups in Japan tend to be a lot more inward looking. So they have more, their like kind of vision is not to take over the world, but just to take over Japan. And that, makes them, I think, a little less competitive in the sense that they're not able to raise more capital from overseas, or, connect maybe as much with companies overseas that could help them go a bit more global, right? And it's also because of that, the competition is just not as, I would say, fierce here. Whereas, because their product is only really getting tested in the local market, right? And in the local market, there's usually not a lot of, like, the ecosystem hasn't really been built up as much. So there's not a lot of competition, right? So they're in sort of like a blue ocean. And I think it can make startups quite vulnerable here, if they don't have, a way um, to sort of insulate themselves or protect themselves from tech companies coming from overseas. So Slack is a great example, right? Like, there were some homegrown solutions, but Slack is like a globally tested, globally beloved product. And so they simply just spent a few $1 million on a marketing campaign here, hired a team to do a bit of localization. And now, we see just so many companies adopting Slack. And so that really poses a bit of a threat to Japanese companies. But I think, there are more and more startups popping up. It's becoming less of a stigma here to, start your own company. There's now a bit more of an allure, right? Whereas before, if you quit your job at Mitsui, it was just like, that was just unfathomable to people. And now it's starting to look cooler, maybe. I would say even startups here also, they struggle to find talent, right? They struggle to find people who will be able to build this idea that they had in mind, or simply be able to drive the company into, fruition. I think that talent is still very lacking here. And so, our students, they go into startups as well. And I think what makes our graduates really great is a lot of them are making career switches, right? So not only are you hiring someone who is a software engineer and has the technical skills, you're also hiring someone who has work experience already, right? Rather than hiring a 22-year-old out of university who's never worked. And, they can code, sure, but, as you know, it takes a lot more than just technical skills to be successful. You also need to be able to see how you can drive business value, work with other people, right, on a team. So there's all of these other things that I think, especially people making a career change are able to offer. And I'm waiting for Japan to fully embrace that, because I think there's a lot of people in Japan stuck in jobs that they, got out of university and haven't had the ability or opportunity or maybe confidence to do something that makes them a bit more passionate and maybe, makes them a bit more productive. So yeah, waiting for that to happen. It is slowly happening, though, mostly out of sheer need, right? Because companies just have trouble hiring.
I myself have a decade of experience as a university lecturer in the previous decade, 2000, 2010. And one of my observations during that time was that, really the college students, university students aren't really trained to do anything in Japan. They're more or less just meant to be good memorizers, to be diligent workers. And in the old system, the industrial system, it was, really when they joined the big company that they would get trained to do whatever it was that they were supposed to do. Um, but at the same time, that system's now breaking down very clearly. Even the major business organizations admit that. And the young people themselves are much less attracted to the kinds of jobs that their fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers used to go into. So that being the case, what is the challenges for education of a young workforce, and how many of these young Japanese are actually willing to be entrepreneurs and to take the risks that are associated with that kind of lifestyle?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think there has been a major shift in the mindset and thinking of young people in Japan. I remember reading an article where they did a survey of graduating college students, and something like, I think it was like 3 out of 5 said that they don't plan on being in their first job for more than like 5 years. And 3 out of 5 is I mean, looking at it as an American, it's a small amount, right? But I think that's a huge step for Japan, because that in the past it was just like, you would just stay at a company forever. And so I think things are definitely changing. I think young people are really taking into account like, hey, I want to have a family and a good personal life as well as, working to support. And big companies just are less and less able to offer that, right? Salaries really have not risen very much in Japan. And so, as a 22-year-old, you're making, what is it, like 2 million yen, or $20,000 USD in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And then it's just compared to, I think, their counterparts in other developed countries, there's just a lot less maneuverability that young Japanese people have in their careers. And so I really hope that education systems focus on empowerment, um, and application of the things that people learn. Because one, like, I think the application is not utilized or taught very much in university. And then also the sort of, I think, like, lack of confidence is a major issue here as well, where people just, want everything to be perfect before they're willing to make a leap forward, right? Everything has to be planned out. And as you know, like, if you want to be an entrepreneur, like, that just isn't possible. No matter how well you plan, nothing ever goes the way you necessarily dreamed it to go. um, Being an entrepreneur is still very much a niche sort of interest, but it's a growing niche interest. And I see, year after year, more things popping up. There was a movie recently that came out last year called Startup Girls, right? About two girls making a startup together. And I think there's just a lot more stuff out there. So, seeing entrepreneurship coming into the mainstream, I think, is exciting. And of course, Japan has always had entrepreneurial voices, right? So Mikitani-san, there's Horiemon, right? Like, so they've certainly been there, but I think also seeing the successes, particularly in Silicon Valley, and being inspired by it, like, I think that's getting young people excited about potentially being an entrepreneur.
For an advanced country, Japan has one of the most abysmal rates of gender balance in this
Yeah.
country. The number of women in management positions, I don't know what it is right now. I think it's still under 10%. It's really quite bad. And it's also a country which sometimes has difficulty dealing with foreigners and outsiders. And I believe that most of the graduates from your program are actually non-Japanese. So could you speak a little bit about sort of the special challenges that may or may not be faced by women operating in the Japanese startup or business world, and also foreigners?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think women in Japan are really held back by societal pressures and sort of the implicit biases that they face every day. Um, I think, there's a huge lack of education that I've recognized here, and even among, I noticed this with a lot of the Japanese women that I talk to. And, I don't, my Japanese is terrible. So the Japanese women that I talk to, they speak English, which means that they are from a more privileged, status in society. And even then, I still notice that, there's a disconnect in what I see and how I sort of react to something versus, how some of them react. And I think identifying when there is something that creates, maybe a negative outcome, or if there's some kind of implicit bias, I think identifying that is still not common. Not there's just a lack of awareness and a lack of education there. A lot of stuff is just like, shogunai. That's just the way we do it. And a lot of the stuff that's really detrimental to women right now, it's not directed in your face, right? It's not like women can't do this. there is certainly a lot of that, but the stuff that women face day to day is not as direct. And so I think it makes it harder for women to identify it. It can be, simply a phrase like, oh, that's so easy that even my mom can do it, right? Like there is that like sexism sort of like, wrapped in there. It's wrapped pretty deep, but you can still feel it. But, if you haven't been educated, it can be really difficult to communicate why that might be bad. So I think there's a lot of that still needs to get unwrapped, and women still need to learn about. There's also this, I think there's just still this mindset that women should not be in engineering, right? And I still hear this from even younger, women in their 20s saying that, growing up, they were always pushed towards doing humanities, and they've never been pushed towards doing, anything on the engineering side. And so we're dealing with just years and years and years of conditioning, right? And so it's going to be really tough, and it's going to take a long time to undo this sort of cultural conditioning. As for foreigners, there's sort of like two levels of foreigners. There's like the technical interns, the menial laborers. We deal with the other foreigners, the ones who have the ability and the privilege to be able to do a program like ours. And we're, starting to try to, tackle the other issue. So we recently launched a fund for not just for foreigners, but just for single mothers. So we have a scholarship fund now for single mothers in Japan. If you think women have it bad, single mothers, something like 85, like the majority of them are working, single mothers in Japan. Even though the majority of them are working, more than 50% of them live in poverty. Right. And so it's just like, okay, they're trying and they're not getting anywhere. And they're also raising the next generation, right? And the population of single mothers is increasing in Japan. And so it's like, you're raising kind of the future of Japan, and yet you're raising them in poverty. And that really is quite unfair. And so we launched a fund to try to help some of these mothers get into more lucrative and more stable career paths, right? For foreigners in Japan, I mean, COVID has certainly done a number on, I think, the expat community here. I think it's much more difficult for foreigners to find a job if they don't speak Japanese. However, there is so much opportunity in, I think, the engineering field, the tech field here, that if you do speak Japanese, it can be pretty um, you can find a job. There's such a huge need. Um, Foreigners who end up taking our program, I mean, they tend to have already sort of like particular characteristics, right? They're risk taking enough to move to a foreign company, and they often have an upper hand in that they already have experience job hunting, right? And job hunting under like sort of much more stressful conditions. So versus like I think our Japanese graduates, quite a few of them have never job hunted outside of university, right? And it's just like a bit different. So actually, our foreigners, even though it's more difficult for them to find jobs, on average, their incomes out of Codechrysalis are slightly higher than our Japanese students. Um, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but right now our ratio of foreigners versus Japanese is about 50-50, I would say. And that's because we have a Japanese language version of our boot camp. So yeah, so we're able to really have a nice little mix there. Yeah.
You're a very international person, and clearly you've worked in many parts of the world, and you could be now in any part of the world probably you want to working, but you've chosen Japan, and you've chosen to create a new generation of software engineers in Japan. Clearly, there's something exciting you about what's going on here. So why is it that you have decided that helping to build software engineer education in Japan is the place to be right now for you?
Yeah, I think impact here is quite high, right? So, I'm Chinese American, and so it would have been very natural for me to go to China and try to do something. But I'm also of the personality where if I see a rat race somewhere, I'll like go the other direction. And I saw, and I still see this like massive rat race going into China, right? And so for me, I kind of wanted to go the other way, and to me, that other way was Japan, right? Japan had this like massive heyday where they were like the China of then, right? Everyone was learning Japanese. The sort of like the classes before me, the generation before me, like their language was Japanese. My generation, like our language has been like Chinese, and so I sort of went the other way. I thought like there's probably a lot of opportunity that people are leaving, and that's proven to be right, right? Japan in a lot of ways it's such a comfortable place to live. It's stable, it's safe, and there's also a lot of money here. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of education. People are still, it's still one of the most educated populations in the world, right? Despite all the things that we might hear, it's still, the companies here are still very influential. They might not be, at the top, top 50 like they were back in 1989 when I was born, but there's still some massive corporations that are technically advanced, right? Like Japan still makes a lot of like parts that are really intricate and difficult to create, right? It's like Japan and Germany still. And so there's so many great ingredients within Japan, right? You have the memory of being a tech giant. You have the money to be able to support further investment and R&D and development. You have a population that is educated, that can learn, can like do all this stuff. And with these ingredients, I think, if we are able to put these things together, we can be quite influential, right? And there's also not a lot of competition. So to me, it was just like, wow, like there's so many things here, but everyone's looking the other way. That, maybe I should take a look and explore this space and see if there's something that I can do here. Um, Also because Japan is, it's still like a top 3 economy, right? Um, when it comes to women's empowerment here, I think it has so much more influence if we can raise the profiles and the abilities of women. We can sort of do it for the rest of the world in a sense, right? Because there's so much technology coming out of Japan. If we properly unleash half of that population with all these ingredients, I think there's a lot of magic that we can see coming out of here. And so it's, that's kind of my view of where Japan could go. And it's really up to Japan to like do it. And I'm just here sort of like helping, showing them like a potential path. So I'm waiting for, and I'm hoping and hoping Japan really takes that on, because I think as a country with so much soft power, that they could really make quite an impact in a positive way on the world. And that's if the country decides to do that, that remains to be seen.
Okay, well, that's a lovely note to end this podcast on. I want to thank you very much for being our inaugural guest. I think you've been spectacular, and I hope you great success. And hopefully, hopefully, we'll get a chance to interact with you again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, good. I'm so happy for you all to start this podcast. I've been, following the Twitter account. It's been great, especially during COVID. You all were live tweeting these announcements and these press conferences, and they were such they were so helpful in understanding what was going on. So thank you all so much for what you do.
Before we sign off from our first podcast today, let me kind of give you some insight on a few other points. Our objective here is going to be to open up the Japanese world of technology and innovation and sometimes culture in the English language. There's lots going on in this country, but probably not surprisingly, a lot of it's going on in the Japanese language. And part of what we do is to bring that out to the wider world simply by putting it in the international language of English. Our coverage is not simply a matter of this one podcast, however. We're a news service, a daily news service, which you can find at akihabaranews.com. We have a web page there with new headlines going up, and we're even more active on social media. So, for example, on Twitter and Facebook, you can find us at Akihabara News, and we welcome you all to join us there. And finally, another point is that this is a small and independent operation. It's very difficult for us to make ends meet, and if you would like to support us in a more substantial way, the way to do that at this point would be through Patreon. And our Patreon page, however, is not Akihabara News. It goes under the name Shingetsu News Agency. That's Shingetsu News Agency. And the reason for that is that Shingetsu News Agency is our mother company. So thank you once again for joining us today, and we hope that you will tune in again next week and in following weeks to get more insights about the Japanese startup scene and much more.